Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Print Page Turner. And today we are here to discuss this really fascinating and paradigm shifting book that really challenges and subverts the way we have been taught to look at Indian Maharajas and their alliances with the British Raj. And to talk about his book, we have here today Manu Pillai, who is a historian and author of 4 books, and the latest one being False Allies. Hi, Manu. Welcome to the Print.
Thank you for having me, Tina. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So I just wanted to begin with something that came at me like while I was reading the book, which is about these 2 images, right? One of incompetence and the other of opulence. And it's perpetuated by the British, right? And to some extent by our own Indian museums as well, right? So why did it take so long for, let's say, the Maharajas to get their rightful place and in historiography, right? And whose interest was it in to sort of keep the Maharajas trapped in the kind of image that we have so far seen?
You know, when I was doing my first book, The Ivory Throne, the protagonist of that book was a female political ruler in one of these princely states, the state of Travancore. And I realized that she had achieved a great deal during her career. She was only in power for 7 years, but she achieved a lot during that time. And I kept thinking, why is it that, she had been sidelined and sort of footnoted in history? And I realized there were 2 things. One, she was a woman, and generally men tend to corner all the space and limelight. So there was that. The other was that although she was a good ruler, she did achieve a great number of things. After independence, the emphasis was so much on the nation, on nationalism, on the freedom struggle, which was obviously a very important thing. So it's not like it was it was disproportionate, but there was a strong emphasis on that. And the country itself had been united after so many problems. Partition had happened, there were secessionist movements, insurgency in the Northeast, all these princely states had to be brought in. So the general narrative was one of sort of unifying it and sort of focusing on the struggle against the British. And it resulted, I think, that academics, of course, have always discussed the princely states. It's not like the princely states have been ignored by academics. From the 70s onwards, there have been serious studies on the princely states. Not that many, but a respectable number. I have no reason to complain about that. But the general narrative was so focused on the nation, the freedom struggle and all of that, that these people were either reduced to just relics of feudalism who had no place in a post-colonial India, or worse, they were seen as pillars of the Raj, allies of the British, and therefore not true to India itself. And that was the general sort of prism through which they were perceived. And it didn't help that in the 1940s and late 1930s, many Maharajas, including in some of the most advanced, wealthiest, progressive states, had become fairly repressive and authoritarian because of other reasons. It was not like they suddenly woke up and became repressive. Due to political reasons, in the final 2 decades before independence, they did themselves no favors. As a result of this, we've not bothered to really look at the princes as an important political segment of Indian society that existed under the Raj, that manipulated the Raj, that was not a meek grouping of people who just sat there and let the Raj do as it pleased. They were interesting political figures. And I'm not arguing in the book that, we need to bring them back or they're great and they were wonderful or any of that. There were bad eggs as well as good eggs. All of that is true. All I'm saying is that if we are to truly make sense of modern Indian history, from the 18th century onwards till 1947, we need to sort of take on board the contributions of these people, good and bad, the events that happened, that took place in the princely states, which were 40% of the Indian subcontinent till 1947. So it's not like you can focus only on British India and exclude everything that happened in this huge chunk that was under Indian rule. The word often used is indirect rule by the British, but I prefer to say British ruled India and Indian ruled India. They may not have had full autonomy, but they were still Indians ruling over Indians. And it's an important part of modern Indian history. So my argument is just that we need to take it more seriously and study it more seriously.
So the other major part of the book is Ravi Varma, the paintings. And so, it's an interesting point that Ravi Varma was, as good in painting as he was a diplomat, right? And he was navigating the politics of the court. And it's not something like when we're looking at, Raja Ravi Varma, it's only the paintings and probably his own, life that we sort of discuss about. So I was like very interesting to, I think I would want you to sort of tell our audience more about Raja Ravi Varma, the diplomat, if we can call him that.
He was obviously a talented artist. He painted very well. But one important thing to recognize with Raja Ravi Varma is that he was also of a certain background and class. One of the reasons I used him to sort of shortlist my 5 princely states that I study in the book. So the introduction is generic, but the focus of the book is through 5 princely states, each different from the other. The reason I chose him was because he helped me pick those states. He's gone around doing portraits of Maharajas around India. He's also, of course, printed lithographs of Tilak and nationalists as well. But in the princely states, he was this glamorous portrait painter. He was commissioned to do mythological works as well by Maharaja of Mysore, Maharaja of Baroda. And those mythological works became an important part of India's nationalist imagery. So, when India and the nationalists were sort of building up a common imagery for the country, the gods, common Hindu culture, and all of that, it was often the Ravi Varma image that came into people's eyes because of his prints, which were very popular. So he was not a political figure, but he was of political significance also. And he was important because his paintings are also a method by which not just to look at how these Rajas looked, but what they wanted to project of themselves. So how a Raja stands or sits, what is in his hand, what are the books on his desk, what is the background, all of these things are signals to the viewer. So, in the Mysore painting, for example, you'll see the Raja standing with his hand on his hip in one of them. And he looks like he's very busy, like he's just about to walk out of the frame and resume work. But in the background, you also have an old element, which is supposed to signify continuity. And of course, in multiple paintings, there are English books with English titles. And these titles also supposed to reflect that, oh, these are modern men, very comfortable in an anglicized world. So they're both traditional, but also modern. And Raja Ravi Varma, because he came from an aristocratic family, his sisters-in-law were the Maharanis of Travancore, his granddaughters were later adopted into the Travancore royal family as well. He was very comfortable moving around in these circles, very much not as a complete equal, but as somebody who was part of that same world. So there were other talented artists in his day as well, but they were treated often as artisans and craftsmen, whereas he was treated more like an equal and as a dignitary. So in Udaipur, when he went, for example, there was a local painter who had actually gone to London and studied, but he was on his darbar salary and not treated as anything special. Whereas Ravi Varma, when he came after he did his work, not only was he paid a handsome fee in rupees, he was also given a necklace, he was also given robes of honor, like he was a dignitary. And he was therefore very aware of this particular position he possessed. And he made use of that, and that allowed a lot of doors to open for him. And because those doors opened for him, and because he sort of worked in these princely states and had a rather unique window into the states and what was happening there. His brother had diaries that he kept recording, all their visits to all these states, the behaviors of different Maharajas. Some would talk a lot, some would talk less, some would speak in Hindi, some would speak in English. Small details like that you can pick out from that narrative and the story of Ravi Varma helps bring to life that period a little better. So I thought that's why, I wanted to marry Ravi Varma, not just the talented painter, but you're right, the sort of diplomatic figure, the dignitary, with the political history of these states. And he becomes the common thread through which the 5 states are connected.
Okay. So how should Indians in the 21st century sort of approach the volatile subject, I would say, of history? Because right now it's volatile. So I just want to know your views on that.
Well, history in that sense has always been slightly volatile because it's always being rewritten, right? It's not as though people say, oh, today history is being rewritten. History is always being rewritten. The whole point of history is that I make an argument, someone makes a counter argument, and history is always also a debate. So, that's always a given, but that usually happens in a sober academic sense. It happens among people who are often trained and understand how to deal with this kind of material. The politicization of history is what makes it very volatile. So, and that, frankly, when I wrote this book, I think I put out the cover on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or one of those places. And there's actually somebody who commented saying, oh, you'll soon be arguing that we should bring back the privy purses. Nobody's even seen the book. Nobody's even seen what the argument of the book is. And if you look at the more serious interviews in the press, they all say that the book does not glorify the Rajas. It merely studies them. So there is a degree of social media angst that comes. And when it's politicized, this angst becomes double. It becomes like this huge thing that's there. But I think in general, we should just approach history firstly by going back to the good books that are written on it. don't consume all your history from social media. I think it's important to communicate history on social media and make use of social media to put ideas out there, to put arguments out there. But I don't think it can be the sole source of Indian history. And the great advantage we have today in the 21st century is that a lot of writers are doing what is called narrative history, which is not your academic textbooks and jargon, but history written in a style that is meant to bring out all its richness, all its fun, all its comedy, all its tragedy, without making it overwhelming for the reader. On the contrary, by making it a pleasurable sort of experience for the reader. Ira Mukherjee, for example, William Dalrymple doesn't need to be named. So many others, Rudrangshu Mukherjee is he's a scholar, and he's written a book on the Rani of Jhansi and the Begum of Awadh. These are written for a general audience who can trust the writer's capacity to research and do their job well, while also enjoying the process of reading the book and enjoying history for the riches that it can give us.
Okay. Could you please describe which royal family you think has the best maintained or best preserved archives?
Archives, I mean, the thing is, different families have dealt with it in different ways. I've been told of one family, I won't take names because these are sensitive issues for some, but apparently some decades after independence, they just destroyed all their palace records, thinking, what is the use of our accounts and, how much grain came into the palace and all of that. But frankly, somebody could do a whole PhD based on palace records of that type. Others, on the other hand, have often donated material they've had to government archives, manuscripts, palm leaf, records, etc. Those are now in government places. It's not as though government archives have been run very well. They are often afflicted by the same problems. A lot of palace buildings, I know, is very difficult to maintain, and it's not even the artworks that are in some of the palaces. It's not easy to restore a painting. The kind of money it costs to keep a painting in good health. All of these are complicated subjects. And I know, for example, the Baroda royal family is trying very hard to do a very good job because they've got a proper museum. They've got a museum on the ground floor of the palace. They do allow people to come into the palace and see things, but it's an uphill task because, keeping all this properly is not easy. Even cataloging material is not easy. There's so much documentation. My first book, The Ivory Throne, the last Maharani's papers alone, it just came out of one trunk, but it took me years to really sift through the whole thing because there was so much of it, and each and every document needs to be perused and read and understood and then connected to other documents. Then you go to another archive and connect it to things that archive can supply you with. Then you construct your narrative. And so I can only imagine the kind of material that other families are sitting on. Not all of it, unfortunately, is available. A lot of it has simply been destroyed. A lot of it is wasted away and rotted away. And some of it has been perhaps even actively destroyed because it could be embarrassing or problematic or politically troublesome for the descendants who are around today. So it's a mixed game, but as of now, there's still plenty to chew on. It's not as though everything has disappeared.
So tell my viewers, an anecdote from your book about the subversion, because you're talking about that there's a level of subversion there, and how there has been secret helping of the freedom fighters by the Maharajas. I think the audience would want to know that.
Yes, I mean, the best example would be Sayajirao Gaikwad of Baroda. This is a boy at the age of 12, he's installed. There's a Maharaja in Baroda, the British get rid of him, accusing him of misgovernment and trying to poison people and all of that. And then they look at who can we put on the throne. So the nearest relative who's available is a grown man in his 20s, and the British decide, no, we don't want a grown man. We want a boy of malleable age. Malleable because then they can train him, they can educate him, and in essence, they can determine what kind of a ruler he will be and how loyal he will be to the British Raj. So they find a very distant relative of the royal family, a 12-year-old boy who was illiterate and working on a farm, not even in the state, far away in the Bombay presidency, bring him to Baroda and install him on the throne. He's bombarded with lectures on loyalty to the British. He's got a divan who's lecturing him. He's got a white man who's teaching him. The state's Maharani is also trying to control him. But he comes out of this very much as a young prince with a mind of his own. And from day one, he began to question the kind of power the British claimed. For example, when his installation in power was being discussed, Sayajirao was told that, there'll be some temporary restrictions just to see if you are trained enough. And, in due course, those can be removed. He said, fine, I understand the logic of having some restraints on my power in the initial phase, but give me an exact deadline. And they said, no, in due course, there's no need for a deadline. And he said, no, I want a very clear deadline because I'm not going to work indefinitely. And it was wise because another Maharaja in Rajputana didn't got to get a deadline written down. And the poor man for almost a decade had the British withdraw and hold back some powers from him. And he needed to get permission for every small thing. So in Baroda, Sayajirao showed that right at the start that he had a mind of his own. And he was also interacting with people like Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra, Gokhale, Ranade. These were the kind of early nationalists he was moving around with, talking with. He supported Dadabhai Nauroji's election to the House of Commons in Britain. And this was a time when the governor of Bombay actually said, oh, these natives can't even rule themselves. How dare a black man get into the parliament in London? And there was something mischievous about the fact that it was not just Sayajirao Gaikwad, but several Maharajas in Western India and elsewhere who actually funded Dadabhai Nauroji's campaign, because election campaigns are expensive. At one point, it was found that Sayajirao Gaikwad, whenever he went abroad, he was meeting and interacting with revolutionaries, Madam Kama, Shamji Krishna Varma, Taraknath Das, etc. He coolly funded the Congress party. The royal families were told in the late 1880s itself not to support the Congress or show too much enthusiasm. This gentleman, not only did he speak on Congress platforms and give speeches in which he spoke of national government, national culture, a future India where the Raj would have ended, he was actually supporting the Congress financially despite strict orders from the Viceroy not to do that. Subversion in other ways also. Lord Curzon would want him to come for all these imperial darbars where the Rajas would have to bow in front of the Viceroy. And Sayajirao said, no, it would inconvenience me to come. And Curzon said, no, you must come. At which point, luckily for Sayajirao Gaikwad, a widow of a much older Maharaja, a very obscure lady in the palace, died. And he made that an excuse not to go there, saying, oh, a relative of mine has died and I can't go. He was, I think of 167 banned books in India, it was found that 17 of them had been published and printed in Baroda. And, it was well known that his government was just looking the other way. And if they were not actively supporting the publication of this kind of material. And this happened in other states also. The Mysore Maharajas were also capable of playing a double game with the Raj. In Travancore also, there are instances of this, which is why the Raj sometimes had to intervene and impose a minister on the Raja, saying that, we don't trust you, will be loyal to us. So here, we're bringing in a minister to clean things up. So multiple states, you see, there's a constant kind of testing of boundaries with the Raj. Even in Rajputana, there was in Maharana of Udaipur, Fateh Singh, he was not a very great ruler. He was not a very great administrator. He was not a modernizer or a reformer. He had to be pushed for the smallest of things like constructing roads and railways. He was not interested in any of those things. But even he managed to sort of hold his own turf for decades by simply sort of flaunting his Rajput grandeur. And it did have an effect on the British. Many of them did not like the fact that his administration was not up to the mark, but they couldn't always say anything to him. They couldn't admonish him. They couldn't force him, simply because he was such a grand figure. And he knew it. And he used his grandeur as a kind of shield to prevent the Raj from sort of coming in and interfering too much in his state. That's a political activity. He may have been a ruler with a less than stellar record, but he's still politically finding a way to preserve that boundary between himself and the Raj, and preserve it in a way that privileges his terms rather than theirs. So you really have to peel back the layers. And sometimes you find these wonderful quotes. There was this Maharaja in Indore in the 1870s and 80s. And there's a letter he wrote where he says, oh, India was just like a heap of broken stones. And it was the British who came and built it into this great edifice. Now, on the face of it, you'll think, oh my God, what a slavish Raja, totally sucking up to the British. What's interesting is in private correspondence, the British themselves described him as notorious for disloyalty and somebody who gave them persistent opposition. So publicly and in formal correspondence, the Raja is being very oily. But behind the scenes, the British call him one of the most disloyal people in the British Indian Empire. That itself gives you a sense that what you see on the surface is not necessarily what exists if you peel back one or two layers. And I think that is where a lot of this princely politics and subversion comes into light and comes into our gaze in very interesting, sometimes surprising ways.
So we're going to end this with sort of like a fun question, which is, I wanted to know, which is your favorite movie, if any, in any Indian language, on an Indian king, basically.
Oh, I don't know if I've seen any movies on an Indian king. Are there movies on Indian kings?
There are.
Oh.
I mean, even if they are in terms of more romance, as
Oh
rather
God, no. I mean, I can think of several bad movies I've seen, but that would be rude to name
that's
them.
fun too.
Oh, no, no, no. The thing is, in India, we have this unfortunate habit where when we do historical subjects, we put them on pedestals and make them, it's almost as if all the time they have their chests are nicely out and their backs and spines are erect and they're standing in this very rigid way. No, they were human beings. They were human beings, and they also slouched, and they were natural people. They were made of flesh and blood. They had strengths and weaknesses. We've somehow not crossed that place in Indian historical sort of filmmaking, where we can just look at them as human beings with warts and problems and issues, and instead everything has to be perfect. And a period drama suddenly means like everything is just dialogues are all like ultra chaste, the language is ultra formal. These are not things that I think existed in the past. So I think I'll answer that question once I see something that convinces me is a good Indian series on history. As of now, I can't think of anything that has satisfied me. In the West, yes, there are shows like The Crown, even a lesser known show like Victoria. These are all good shows, but in India, I've not seen anything yet. Sorry not to have a fun answer to your very fun question.
No, because we have had like at least a lot of Bollywood offerings on these. The top of my head, I think I could think of Bajirao.
There's Jodha Akbar, Bajirao Mastani, that Jhansi Rani. The thing is, many of these, Padmavat, but these are all a bit over the top. That's what I said. It's not real. Royalty doesn't mean everything is over the top. In fact, the book itself argues that having a palace doesn't mean everybody inside is draped in silks. Palaces were institutions, establishments. There were clerks and bureaucrats and all kinds of things happening there. In fact, what interests me in a palace is not how grand it is, but how did the toilet cleaning system work? How did, in those days, you needed lower caste people, what were called untouchables, to come in and clean your toilet. How did they enter the palace? Where did they enter from? Who cooked in the kitchens? Was it Brahmins? Was it somebody else? That is what interests me about the world of the palace, not the grandeur of the palace and supposedly being in awe of a big building. In that sense, every big building should strike us. But the palace itself is, again, representative of an entire universe. And that is what interests me. Again, I've given you a very long answer to what was meant to be a short, fun question. My apologies for that.
No, I mean, it's good to know, because a lot of people, I think, again, I'm asking more as an audience here who's just watched, in the top of my head, you've had iconic movies, let's say, on kings, which are considered iconic. I wouldn't say they're iconic movies by themselves, but yeah, they're considered iconic. But yes, I do get what you're saying. Like, I think it's a festival of opulence rather than adhering to.
It's not about their humanness. That's never really come across. In the movie on the Rani of Jhansi, also every dialogue out of her mouth is nationalistic, patriotic. It's a bit dull, frankly. It reduces a very rich historical figure into this caricature who's just mouthing patriotic dialogues through 2 hours of that film's length or whatever. And it's disappointing. It really is disappointing. We haven't learned to look at historical figures in their complexity and in a well-rounded way.
And definitely not as just humans and not
Yeah.
figures, actors. In fact, I think we often look at the kings as the actors. Like, okay, this played this role, so I think we see more of the actor in that.
Yes, possibly, yes.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for coming, and sorry for all the glitches that sort of happened.
No, thank you for having me, and I'm glad that we're opening this new series at ThePrint with my book. And I hope you enjoyed reading the book and that your readers will as well.
Of course, which is why we decided to sort of we could begin with this book, which is fun and new and would appeal to a lot of people, I think. And again, it's sort of subverts. Again, I mean, I was thinking of how I had read about Maharajas in my school time and how the book sort of challenges a lot of these notions. Thank you so much.
Thanks.